The office was eerily quiet, save for the constant hum of computers and the occasional murmur of assistants moving between glass-walled cubicles. Alexander Dane, the billionaire CEO known for his ruthless efficiency, sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, eyes locked on a mountain of financial reports and spreadsheets. His phone vibrated repeatedly on the desk, each ring flashing the name he knew so well, Elise. He glanced at it, saw it was her again, and swiped it away without a second thought. "I'll call her later," he muttered to himself, fully convinced that whatever she needed could wait until his deal with the Japanese conglomerate was finalized. But Elise's calls were not casual check-ins. Each one carried the quiet urgency of a heart desperate to be heard. She had tried texting, emailing, even leaving messages through his assistant, but the walls Alexander had built around his focus were impenetrable. Behind the polished facade of the office, a life was stirring, a tiny, fragile heartbeat that depended on both of them. As Alexander's phone continued to vibrate, he leaned back in his chair, stretching his long frame and rubbing his temples. He didn't notice the subtle pang in his chest, the faint whisper of unease that something was amiss. He didn't know that each ignored call was one step closer to a final goodbye, one that no amount of wealth, ambition, or power could ever reverse. The office remained a kingdom of glass and steel, and Alexander, oblivious, was its emperor, blind to the tragedy waiting silently at home. Elise sat alone by the hospital window, the late afternoon light casting long, pale shadows across the sterile room. Her hands rested protectively over her swollen belly, the tiny life inside her a constant, bittersweet reminder of what she and Alexander had created together. She had tried calling him again and again, each ring piercing the quiet of the hospital room, each unanswered call another weight pressing on her chest. Her voice, once steady, had become fragile, trembling with the fear that her pleas were falling into the void of Alexander's ambition. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the private storm raging within the walls of this hospital. Nurses moved quietly down the corridors, their faces sympathetic but distracted, the urgency of other emergencies making her isolation feel sharper. Elise's eyes traced the pattern of rain streaking the glass, each drop mirroring the tears she refused to wipe away. She whispered softly to her unborn child, promising love, safety, and presence, unaware that fate had a cruel irony in store. Inside her womb, a faint heartbeat pulsed rhythmically, fragile yet insistent, a tiny life depending on them both. And yet, the one person she had yearned to hear, the one whose presence could have eased her anxiety, remained absent. Each vibration of her phone was a reminder that Alexander, immersed in his empire, could not see what truly mattered. Her whispers grew quieter, more urgent, as a chilling thought began to settle, that this precious life, this tiny heartbeat, might slip away without ever being cradled in the arms of the father who had already claimed so much of the world, but none of these moments. Time stretched and thickened, heavy with dread. Elise's heart ached not just for the baby she carried, but for the silence of the man who should have been there, the silence that might become the cruelest goodbye of all. Alexander finally looked at his phone, the missed calls blinking insistently on the screen. At first, he thought it was merely a flurry of texts or reminders from his assistant, but the sheer number, the urgency in each notification, made his chest tighten. Something felt off. He dropped the pen he had been twirling, a sense of dread creeping through him. With a snap of his fingers, his assistant appeared, her expression guarded but heavy with unspoken worry. "Alexander, it's Elise. She's at the hospital," she said quietly, her voice trembling. It's urgent." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. In the sterile gleam of his office, surrounded by the symbols of his power, Alexander felt utterly powerless. He bolted from the chair, nearly tripping over the rug in his haste. The familiar city streets blurred past the tinted windows of his car as he drove, each second stretching unbearably. His mind raced, picturing Elise, her hands on her belly, waiting for him, and for the first time, he felt a fear deeper than any business risk he had ever faced. When he reached the hospital, the corridors felt impossibly long and cold. Nurses and doctors moved with quiet efficiency, but none stopped to explain the tension tightening the air. And then he saw her, Elise, pale and trembling, holding herself as if bracing against the world. The assistant's voice caught again. "Alexander, the baby." The words hung like a guillotine over his heart. The deal he had chased, the meetings he had dominated, the empires he had built, none of it mattered. The life that depended on both of them, the tiny heartbeat he had ignored, had slipped away. His legs felt rooted to the floor, as if gravity itself were punishing him. He had missed the calls, missed the signs, missed the last moments he could have shared. In that sterile corridor, surrounded by the echoes of machines and whispered condolences, Alexander understood the cruelest lesson of all. Some losses cannot be undone, and some goodbyes are forever. Grief descended like a slow-moving storm, silent at first, then overwhelming. Alexander stood in the dimly lit hospital room, the soft beep of distant monitors echoing like a reminder of everything that still lived while the one thing he loved most had slipped away. The air was heavy, thick with antiseptic and sorrow. He felt as though breathing itself was a betrayal, of Elise, of the child he never got to meet, of the moments he had allowed to pass him by. Elise sat curled on the hospital bed, her shoulders trembling with a silent ache that shattered him more than any scream ever could. Her gown was wrinkled, her hair clung to her tear-streaked cheeks, but she had never looked more fragile, more human, more heartbreakingly alone. In her arms lay the tiny blanket-wrapped form of their child, impossibly small, heartbreakingly still, an angel that had arrived and departed in the same fragile breath. Alexander moved toward her slowly, as if the weight of guilt chained his feet to the floor. Each step felt like walking through the wreckage of his own making. She did not look at him at first. She couldn't. He understood that, and yet it tore at him, deeper than any failure he had ever endured. "Can I?" His voice cracked. He swallowed hard. "Can I hold them?" Elise hesitated, not out of anger, but out of sorrow. She looked down at the tiny bundle, brushed a trembling finger along the soft cheek that no longer warmed under her touch. When she finally lifted her gaze to him, he saw everything, her love, her grief, her disappointment, her exhaustion from carrying this burden alone while he chased boardrooms and billion-dollar dreams. She nodded. He sank into the chair beside her, hands shaking violently as she placed the baby gently into his arms. The child weighed almost nothing, yet in that moment, Alexander felt as if the universe itself had collapsed against his chest. He stared at the little face, memorizing features that would never grow, never smile, never call him Dad. A sound broke from deep inside him, a raw, shattering sob. He had never cried like this. Not when his father died, not when he lost half his company during a recession, not when he'd been betrayed by his closest partner. This was different. This was deeper. This was the grief of a man confronting the truth. He had been absent from the moment that mattered most. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears falling onto the blanket. "I wasn't there. I should have been there. I should have answered. I should have." His voice dissolved, strangled by emotion. Elise leaned into him then, not with anger, but with devastation, two broken hearts leaning on each other because there was no one else who could understand the depth of this loss. "We lost so much today," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I didn't want to lose you too." The words pierced him. In that moment, Alexander understood a truth harsher than any corporate lesson. Success meant nothing if he wasn't present for the people who gave his life meaning. He held his child close, memorizing every detail he would never get to see again. He vowed silently, fiercely, painfully, that he would never let ambition blind him again. That he would show up. That he would choose love over empire, presence over power, family over everything. But vows could not change reality. And some goodbyes were carved in stone. When the nurse gently stepped in to take the baby for the final time, Alexander clung for one more second, one last moment, before letting go. It was the hardest thing he had ever done.